Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel far backward through time, back beyond modern cities, beyond highways and electric lights, beyond the rise of nations as we now understand them, into a land that existed thousands of years before most familiar history began, a land between two rivers, the Tigris to the east, the Euphrates to the west, two long ancient rivers flowing slowly through a dry, sunlit landscape in what is today the country of Iraq. This region became one of the earliest places on Earth where human beings began building cities, where writing first appeared, where temples rose above flat plains, where laws were carved into stone, and stories were pressed into clay. Ancient Mesopotamia. The name itself comes from Greek words meaning the land between the rivers, but long before any Greek traveler arrived to describe it, this place had already supported civilization for thousands of years. Some of the oldest cities ever discovered by archaeologists existed here. Some of the oldest written documents in human history were found within its ruins. Some of the oldest stories ever recorded were composed beside its riverbanks long ago. For most of human existence, people lived as hunters and gatherers. They moved with the seasons. They followed game and gathered wild plants. They did not stay in one place for long. But in Mesopotamia, something changed slowly over many generations. People began farming. They learned to plant grain. They learned to channel water from the rivers into the fields. They learned to store food, to build permanent homes, to live together in growing settlements that eventually became cities. This was not a sudden transformation. It happened over thousands of years. Quietly, generation by generation. A child in one century might farm slightly more carefully than their grandparents had. A village in one century might grow slightly larger than the village remembered by its oldest inhabitants. The shape of civilization formed gradually, like layers of sediment settling at the bottom of a slow river, and the rivers themselves shaped everything. The Tigris and Euphrates begin far to the north, in the cold mountains of what is today eastern Turkey. From those highlands, they flow southward for hundreds of miles. They wind across hot, dry plains. They pass through marshes and reed beds. They eventually empty into the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. Along the way, they deposit rich silt across the land. This silt made the soil of southern Mesopotamia extraordinarily fertile. Plants could grow there in abundance. Grain could be harvested season after season. Animals could be raised in great numbers. The land beside the rivers became, in many ways, an oasis surrounded by desert. Yet the rivers were never gentle. They flooded unpredictably. Sometimes they rose too high, sometimes too low. Sometimes they shifted course entirely, abandoning old riverbeds and carving new ones across the plain. Cities that once stood beside flowing water might find themselves stranded miles away from any river within a single lifetime. Crops planted in spring might be destroyed by sudden floods before harvest. Drought could starve entire regions. Storms could damage the dikes and canals that farmers had worked for generations to build. So, the people who lived in Mesopotamia learned, very early in human history, to organize themselves carefully, to work together, to build systems that no single family could maintain alone. Irrigation canals had to be dug, riverbanks had to be reinforced, floodwaters had to be diverted, granaries had to be filled to protect against bad years. And this kind of coordination required something new. It required leadership, written records, shared labor, and shared rules. In other words, it required cities. The first true cities in human history appeared in southern Mesopotamia, in a region known as Sumer. These were not simply large villages. They were complex, organized communities with thousands of inhabitants. They had temples, they had marketplaces, they had walls, they had artisans and laborers and priests and farmers and merchants. They had streets and houses and storage rooms and workshops. They had everything we would today recognize as the basic shape of urban life. Among the earliest of these cities was Eridu, then Uruk, then then Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and many others. Each city had its own ruler. Each had its own patron god. Each had its own walls and its own surrounding farmland. They traded with one another. They sometimes fought with one another. They formed alliances and rivalries. They built and rebuilt over thousands of years, layer upon layer, until the very ground beneath them rose into low hills made entirely of the remains of older cities buried deep below. To stand within one of these ancient Sumerian cities thousands of years ago must have felt remarkable. Mud brick walls rising in every direction, narrow streets winding between flat-roofed houses, the sound of cattle, voices, hammering, grinding stones, smoke from cooking fires drifting upward into clear desert sky, reed boats moving slowly along canals, donkeys pulling carts of grain, children playing in shaded doorways, the temple rising high above everything, visible from miles across the plain. The temple was the heart of every Sumerian city. It was not only a place of worship, it was also a center of economic activity, of record keeping, of administration. The grain harvests were stored there. The labor of the community was organized there. The priests who served the temple were among the most powerful people in the city. And rising above the temple itself was a structure unique to Mesopotamia, a tall, stepped tower built of mud brick, a ziggurat. The ziggurats were enormous. They rose in tiered platforms, each smaller than the one beneath it, with stairways winding up the sides. At the top stood a small shrine dedicated to the city's patron god. Priests climbed the steps to perform rituals there. The people below looked upward toward the sacred peak. The ziggurat connected heaven and earth in the imagination of the people. It was the highest point in a city otherwise made of low, flat buildings. It could be seen from far across the plains, glowing pale in the morning sun, casting long shadows in the evening. The most famous ziggurats included those of of Uruk, and later of Babylon. Some of them have partially survived for thousands of years. Even today, their ruined foundations can be visited, standing patiently among the dry hills, watched only by the wind and the occasional bird. And throughout the centuries, beneath the shadow of these temples, ordinary life continued. Sumerian farmers rose before dawn. They walked out to their fields, often through narrow lanes of mud brick walls, past sleeping neighbors and dusty palm trees. They tended their crops. They cleaned irrigation channels. They harvested barley and wheat. They raised sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. They worked in the heat of the long Mesopotamian day, beneath a sky that often remained cloudless, for weeks at a time. In the evening, they returned to their homes, ate simple meals of bread, beer, vegetables, and dates, and slept on flat roofs to escape the heat of the indoor rooms below. Many Sumerians drank beer daily. It was made from barley and was thicker and more nutritious than modern beer. Some scholars believe that the development of beer may have been one of the original motivations for cultivating grain in the first place. Beer was so central to daily life that workers were sometimes paid in it. Even the temple offered beer to the gods. Other people worked as craftspeople. Potters shaped clay on slowly turning wheels. Weavers made cloth from wool and from flax. Metal workers cast tools and weapons from copper and later from bronze. Builders shaped mud bricks and stacked them into walls. Carpenters worked with imported wood. Since timber was scarce in southern Mesopotamia, jewelers crafted beads from shell, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and gold. Some of these crafted objects have survived to this day, still beautiful, still impressive, sitting quietly behind glass in museums around the world. Merchants traveled between cities and across distant lands. They carried grain, cloth, pottery, and beer. They brought back copper from the north, timber from the mountains, precious stones from the east, and even more exotic goods from across the seas. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, to the highlands of Iran, to Anatolia, to the Mediterranean. Some merchants traveled by donkey caravan across hot, dusty plains. Others sailed on reed boats down the rivers and out onto the Gulf. The world of ancient Mesopotamia was already, in its own way, deeply connected to the wider world around it. And among all of these activities, perhaps the most extraordinary development of all was something quiet, something small, something that began as a simple, practical tool, writing. Long before any modern alphabet existed, Sumerian scribes pressed small wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets using sharpened reeds. These marks were the foundation of one of the earliest known writing systems in human history. The script is called cuneiform, from a Latin word meaning wedge-shaped. It was not based on letters as we know them today. It was based on signs that originally represented objects, words, and sounds. At first, writing was used mostly for practical record keeping. The temple needed to track how much grain had been collected. The city needed to record who owned which fields. The merchants needed to remember who owed what to whom. A scribe sat cross-legged in a cool back room, pressing patterns into soft clay, then setting the tablet aside to dry in the sun. Once hardened, the tablet became permanent. It could be filed away in a temple archive and consulted years later. Over centuries, writing expanded. Soon, scribes were recording letters between kings. They were copying out hymns to the gods. They were noting down medical recipes, astronomical observations, lists of stars, lists of months, lists of cities. They were writing legal contracts. They were recording the heights of the rivers each spring. They were preserving the names of long dead rulers. Eventually, they were writing literature. Long poems, stories of heroes, myths about the creation of the world, reflections on suffering and mortality, and the search for meaning in a brief human life. To become a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia required years of study. Schools existed in many cities. Young students sat together on benches, learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs by copying them again and again onto fresh clay tablets. The schools were called Edaba, which means tablet house. Students memorized lists of words. They practiced calculations. They studied old hymns and stories. They were sometimes harshly disciplined. Some surviving tablets are simply student exercises, the same lines copied out repeatedly, sometimes with small mistakes still visible after thousands of years. To be a scribe was to hold real power in Mesopotamian society. Most people could not read or write. The scribes managed the affairs of the temples, the palaces, and the merchants. They sometimes rose into high administrative positions. They preserved the memory of the past and prepared the records of the present. Without them, much of what we know about Mesopotamia today would have been lost long ago. And remarkably, because cuneiform was pressed into clay rather than written in ink on parchment, many of those records have survived. Clay does not rot. Clay does not burn easily. In fact, when ancient cities were destroyed by fire, the tablet stored inside often became hardened in the flames, baked like pottery, preserved for thousands of years beneath the rubble. Modern archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of thousands of such tablets. Many remain only partially translated even today. Some are still being deciphered. Each tablet is a small window into a vanished world. A receipt for a delivery of grain, a letter from a worried mother to a traveling son, a complaint from a customer about poor quality copper, a love poem, a prayer, a list of medicines, a school exercise. The everyday life of people who lived thousands of years ago, still legible, still personal, still recognizable. And among all the writings that survive from ancient Mesopotamia, perhaps the most famous is a long poem, a story about a king who lived in the city of Uruk, a king named Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest known works of literature in the world. It tells of a powerful and restless ruler who befriends a wild man from the wilderness named Enkidu. Together they have adventures. They travel into distant forests. They fight monsters. They challenge the gods. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is overwhelmed by grief. He sets out on a long journey to find the secret of immortality. He crosses dangerous waters. He meets a survivor of an ancient flood. He nearly obtains the gift of eternal life, but loses it. In the end, he returns home to Uruk, having learned that even the greatest king must one day die, and that the only true immortality lies in the lasting works of human civilization itself. The poem was composed and recomposed over many centuries. It was copied by countless scribes. Versions of it have been found in different cities and in different languages. The fullest version that survives was recovered from the ruined library of an Assyrian king who lived more than 2,500 years ago. The tablets were broken and scattered when the library was destroyed, but scholars in the modern era pieced them back together, and when the story was first translated again, after thousands of years of silence, people read it with wonder. The story felt strangely familiar, the grief over a lost friend, the fear of death, the longing for meaning, the acceptance of mortality. These feelings, recorded thousands of years ago, still spoke clearly to readers of the modern world. Mesopotamia gave humanity many gifts, but perhaps one of the deepest was this: the recognition that human beings, across all the long centuries, share something essential: the same hopes, the same sorrows, the same wonder at the night sky, the same brief lives passing beneath the slow movement of stars. And the Epic of Gilgamesh was only one of many great stories preserved on Mesopotamian clay. There were others, older, stranger, woven through with images of gods and monsters, and the slow making of the world. One of the most important of these was a poem now known as the Enuma Elish, which means simply when on high. The first two words of the text, it was the great Babylonian poem of creation. It described how, in the beginning, there was no earth and no sky, only mingled waters, Apsu, the fresh water beneath the ground, Tiamat, the salt water of the sea. From their joining, the first generations of gods were born. The new gods quarreled with the old. A great battle followed. The young god Marduk, champion of his generation, faced Tiamat in single combat. He defeated her. He split her body in two, and from one half made the dome of the sky, and from the other half made the earth. From her tears flowed the Tigris and the Euphrates. Then Marduk created human beings out of clay and the blood of a defeated god, so that humans might serve the gods and free them from the labor of the world. This story was recited each year during the great New Year festival in Babylon. For many days, priests and the king performed elaborate rituals connected to it. The recitation of the poem was itself considered a sacred act, helping to renew the order of the universe. For another turn around the sun, there was also the long and somber poem now called the Atrahasis Epic. It described how the gods, weary of human noise and disorder, decided to send a great flood to destroy mankind. One wise man, warned in advance by the god of fresh water, built a great boat. He brought aboard his family, his animals, the seeds of every plant. He sealed the door and waited. The rains came. The rivers rose. The world was covered. For days the boat drifted across an endless sea. At last, the waters receded. The boat came to rest on the slopes of a mountain. The survivors gave thanks. The gods, looking down at the silent, flooded world, regretted what they had done. A version of this story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as well, told to the king by the survivor of the flood himself, whose name was Utnapishtim, and echoes of it spread across many later traditions in the wider region. The flood is one of the oldest preserved stories in human civilization. Its earliest forms were written in Mesopotamian cuneiform thousands of years ago. There was also the haunting story of Inanna and her journey into the underworld. Inanna, the great goddess of love and war, descended through 7 gates into the dark land of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. At each gate, she was forced to surrender a piece of her clothing and a piece of her power. By the time she reached the throne of her sister, she stood stripped and helpless. She was killed and hung upon a hook. The world above grieved. Plants stopped growing. Animals stopped mating. The other gods, finally moved by the loss, sent messengers to rescue her. She was restored to life, but only on the condition that another soul take her place. She returned to the upper world, and her young husband Dumuzi was carried down into the dark in her stead. Each year, his descent and return marked the changing of seasons. His absence brought the dry months. His return brought the rains. The story of Inanna's descent is among the oldest surviving narratives in the world. It has lost very little of its strange beauty even after thousands of years. The image of the goddess passing through 7 gates, surrendering ornament after ornament, has continued to echo across countless later literatures. It reads like a dream that the human mind first dreamed beside the slow waters of Sumer and never quite forgot. And remarkably, we know the name of at least one of the poets who shaped these ancient traditions. Her name was Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon, the great empire builder. She served as high priestess of the moon god in the city of Ur. She composed long hymns to the goddess Inanna. She signed her name to her work. She is the earliest named author in all of recorded human history, not the earliest writer. Writing had existed for centuries before her, but she was the first whose personal voice and identity were preserved with her work. A woman, a poet, a priestess, writing more than 4,000 years ago in the language of Sumer. Her hymns describe Inanna with awe and intimacy. She praises the goddess as both terrible and tender. She speaks of her own struggles, her own exile during a time of political unrest, her own prayers for restoration. She emerges from the clay tablets not as a distant figure of legend, but as a real person, thoughtful, devout, articulate, determined, a voice rising clearly from the deep past, carrying her own name forward across thousands of years. And Heduana is a reminder that women throughout Mesopotamian history played roles far more varied and substantial than later generations sometimes assumed. Women served as priestesses in many temples. They managed great estates connected to temple lands. They worked as midwives, healers, brewers, weavers, and tavern keepers. Some operated as merchants, even traveling on business across long distances. Others ran their own workshops. Mesopotamian legal records show women buying and selling property, lending money, signing contracts, testifying in court. Some royal women wielded enormous influence at the courts of kings. Family life centered around the household. Several generations often lived together under one roof, in homes built of mud brick around a small inner courtyard. Marriages were typically arranged between families, often involving negotiations about gifts, dowries, and obligations. Children were highly valued. Parents prayed to the gods for healthy births. Names were chosen carefully, often referring to a deity or to a hope for the child's future. Babies were swaddled and rocked. Mothers carried young children on their hips as they worked. Older children helped with chores from an early age, learning by quiet imitation the skills they would need as adults. Schools, as already mentioned, existed primarily for boys preparing to become scribes, though some girls also learned to read and write, especially in priestly families. For most children, education came from working alongside parents and elders. A farmer's son learned by walking the fields with his father. A potter's daughter learned by watching her mother's hands shape clay on the wheel. The slow, patient transmission of skill from one generation to the next, passing forward century after century without ever being written down. Society was layered. There were free citizens of varying wealth. There were dependent workers who labored on the estates of temples or of wealthy households. There were slaves, often acquired through war or debt, who could sometimes earn their freedom over time. Mesopotamian law codes, including that of Hammurabi, included specific provisions about the treatment of slaves. The system was not gentle by modern standards, but it was a system of recognized status and recognized rights. not an undifferentiated cruelty. Slaves could own small property. They could marry. Their children sometimes inherited freedom. The boundaries between social classes were not always rigid. And throughout the long arc of Mesopotamian history, the rhythms of daily life remained recognizable. A meal of bread and onions and fish beside the slow river. A festival day when the streets filled with music. A child sent to fetch water from the canal. A scribe finishing a long day of tablet work and walking home through the dust of evening. A grandmother telling a story she had learned in her own childhood. An old man sitting beneath a date palm, watching the sun move slowly across the sky. These small, ordinary moments were, in their own quiet way, the deepest substance of the civilization, the kings and the battles, and the great inscriptions occupy most of the surviving records. But beneath those records, in the daily work of millions of people across thousands of years, the real life of Mesopotamia continued. Patient, practical, ordinary, human, and the stars themselves became a special subject of study in ancient Mesopotamia. The night sky over the southern plains was extraordinarily clear. Without modern artificial lights, the stars appeared with overwhelming brightness. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of pale light. The planets moved slowly along their familiar paths. The moon waxed and waned. The constellations rose and set with the seasons, and the priests and scholars of Mesopotamia watched these movements carefully. Night after night, generation after generation, they believed that the heavens carried meaning, that the movements of the stars and planets were connected to events on Earth, that careful observation of the sky might allow them to predict floods, harvests, wars, and the fates of kings. This belief led them to develop one of the earliest sustained systems of astronomical observation in human history. They named the constellations. Many of the constellation names that we still use today, including some of the signs of the zodiac, can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamian sources. They tracked the movements of the planets with remarkable accuracy. They predicted eclipses. They divided the year into months based on the phases of the moon. They divided the day into smaller units, and they used a number system based on the number 60. This is why, even today, There are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. It is why there are 360 degrees in a circle. The choice of 60 as a base for measurement was a Mesopotamian decision made thousands of years ago and inherited by every modern civilization. When you glance at a clock today, you are reading time according to a system first developed in Sumer. Mathematics in Mesopotamia was advanced and practical. Scribes calculated the areas of fields. They solved problems involving the volumes of grain. They worked out the proportions of building materials. They understood quadratic equations long before such ideas appeared elsewhere. They developed multiplication tables. They created lists of square and cube roots. They studied geometry. They left behind tablets covered with neat columns of numbers, evidence of patient and careful thought that took place beside oil lamps in quiet rooms thousands of years ago. And medicine, too, was studied and recorded. Mesopotamian healers kept lists of symptoms and treatments. They prescribed herbs, oils, minerals, and ritual practices. They sometimes performed simple surgeries. They believed that illness might have both natural and supernatural causes. They prayed to specific gods of healing. They also tested remedies through careful observation. Their medical tablets describe conditions that modern physicians can still recognize. Diseases of the eyes, of the stomach, of the lungs, injuries from accidents and from battle, the ordinary suffering of ordinary human bodies, carefully described in cuneiform thousands of years ago. And throughout it all, the gods watched. Religion shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian life. The people believed that the world was filled with divine powers. Each city had its own patron deity. Each natural force, each phenomenon, each aspect of life had its own god or goddess. The sun god, Shamash, brought daylight and justice. The moon god, Sin, presided over the night and the calendar. The storm god, Adad, brought rain. Enlil ruled the winds. Enki ruled the waters beneath the earth. Inanna, also known as Ishtar, was the goddess of love and war, of the morning and evening star. Marduk eventually became the chief god of Babylon. There were hundreds of others, great and small, with their own temples, their own priests, their own festivals. The gods were imagined as powerful, but not always kind. They could be generous. They could be cruel. They could quarrel among themselves. They could be persuaded or angered. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that human beings had been created to serve the gods, to grow food for their temples, to build and maintain their sanctuaries, to honor them with offerings. In return, the gods might grant good harvests, healthy children, peaceful cities, and victory in war. Festivals filled the calendar. Each city celebrated the days sacred to its patron god. Crowds gathered in the temples. Offerings of food and drink were laid before the divine statues. Music played. Hymns were sung. Sometimes statues of the gods were carried in procession through the streets. Sometimes elaborate dramas were performed, reenacting ancient mythological events. The new year, especially, was a time of great ceremony. In Babylon, the king himself participated in rituals that lasted for many days, including a moment when he laid down his crown and submitted to the high priest, who then ritually restored his right to rule. Behind these public rituals lay a deep belief that the order of the world depended on the proper relationship between humans and gods. Drought, plague, defeat in battle, civil unrest. These were not random misfortunes. They were signs that the gods were displeased. They required offerings, repentance, and renewed devotion. Prosperity and peace were also signs. They meant the gods were satisfied, that the king ruled wisely, that the temples were honored, that the people were faithful. And while all this religious and intellectual life unfolded in the cities, the political map of Mesopotamia was constantly changing. For long stretches of history, the region was divided into many independent city-states. Each had its own king. Each competed with its neighbors for land, water, trade routes, and prestige. Sometimes one city would briefly dominate the others. Then it would weaken, and another would rise in its place. The dance of rivalries and alliances continued century after century. But eventually, larger empires began to emerge, larger than any single city, spanning many regions, ruled by ambitious kings. The first great empire builder in Mesopotamian history was a king named Sargon. He came from humble origins, According to legend, he rose through the ranks of an earlier court. He eventually conquered the Sumerian cities one by one, then expanded outward in every direction. He created the Akkadian Empire, named after his capital city of Akkad. This was perhaps the first true empire in human history, in the sense of a single political authority ruling over many different peoples and lands across great distances. Sargon's empire did not last forever. After several generations, it weakened and collapsed. But the idea of empire had been introduced into the world. After Akkad, other powers would rise. The third dynasty of Ur, sometimes called Ur the Third, briefly restored Sumerian rule. Then a different people, the Amorites, gradually took control of the southern cities. From among the Amorite rulers came one of the most famous kings in all of Mesopotamian history, a king of Babylon, a king named Hammurabi. Hammurabi lived nearly 4,000 years ago. When he came to the throne, Babylon was a relatively modest city, one of several powers in the region. Over the course of his long reign, Hammurabi expanded its territory dramatically. He defeated rivals through warfare and diplomacy. He united much of Mesopotamia under his rule, and he became remembered, above all, for one of his other achievements, the compilation of a great body of laws carved into a tall pillar of polished black stone. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most famous legal documents in human history. It contains nearly 300 laws covering a wide range of subjects: the treatment of slaves, the settlement of debts, the repair of damaged property, the penalties for theft and assault, the conduct of trade, the responsibilities of doctors, builders, and shipwrights. Many of the laws are harsh by modern standards. They include the principle often summarized as an eye for an eye, in which a person who caused injury to another would suffer a similar injury in return. But the code also includes provisions intended to protect the weak, the widow, the orphan, the poor. It tried to establish a clear and predictable system of justice, available to all who lived under Babylonian rule. The stone pillar bearing the code was set up in a public place where any who could read might consult it. It was illustrated at the top with a carved image of Hammurabi standing. before the seated figure of Shamash, the god of justice. The image declared, in visual form, that the king's laws came not from his own will alone, but from divine authority. The pillar was eventually carried off as plunder by a later invading army, then lost for centuries beneath the sands. It was rediscovered in the early 20th century by French archaeologists. Today, it stands in the Louvre Museum in Paris, still legible, its ancient cuneiform signs still sharp after nearly 4,000 years. After Hammurabi, Babylon's power eventually waned. Other peoples rose to dominance. The Hittites came down from the north and briefly sacked the city. The Kassites, a mountain people, took control and ruled for centuries in their own quiet way. The political fortunes of Mesopotamia shifted again and again. And then, gradually, a new power began to rise farther north. Along the upper Tigris River, around the cities of Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh, the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire became, in time, one of the largest and most powerful empires the ancient world had ever seen. At its height, it stretched from the highlands of Iran in the east, across all of Mesopotamia, into the lands of the eastern Mediterranean, and even briefly into Egypt. Its kings were famed warriors. Its armies were among the most disciplined and feared in the ancient world. They traveled on horseback and in chariots. They used iron weapons. They employed sophisticated siege engines to attack fortified cities. They built straight roads connecting distant provinces. They organized their territory into administrative districts, governed by appointed officials. The Assyrian kings constructed enormous palaces. They lined their walls with carved stone reliefs depicting royal hunts, military campaigns, ceremonies, and divine protection. Many of these reliefs have survived. They show kings with elaborately curled beards, riding chariots, drawing bows, towering above their enemies. They show winged divine creatures with the bodies of bulls and the faces of men. They show scenes of forests, rivers, mountains, and cities, all rendered in fine detail across long stone panels. To walk through one of these palaces, when it was newly completed, must have been overwhelming. Echoing halls, painted walls, endless rooms filled with attendants, scribes, soldiers, and visiting dignitaries from distant lands. And one Assyrian king in particular became remembered for an achievement of a different kind. King Ashurbanipal ruled from Nineveh in the 7th century, before the Common Era. He was a fierce military leader, but he was also unusual among ancient rulers in that he was himself literate and proud of his learning. He gathered a great library. He sent scribes to every corner of his empire to seek out tablets of every kind, hymns, stories, omens, medical texts, astronomical records, mathematical treatises, royal correspondence, religious incantations. The library at Nineveh became one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the ancient world. When the city was eventually sacked and burned, the library collapsed in flames, but the clay tablets, baked hard by the fire, were preserved beneath the rubble. Centuries later, archaeologists rediscovered them. Tens of thousands of tablets were recovered. They became one of the most important sources of information about the ancient Mesopotamian world that we possess. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its fullest surviving form, came from this library. So did countless other texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. The Assyrians eventually fell. Their empire grew too large to govern. Their constant warfare exhausted them. Subject peoples rebelled. In the late 7th century, before the Common Era, an alliance of enemies, including the Medes from the east and the resurgent Babylonians from the south, finally captured Nineveh. The great Assyrian capital was burned. Its kings died. Its empire collapsed. For centuries afterward, travelers passing the ruined city would not even recognize what had once stood there. The very memory of Assyria faded so completely that some later writers came to doubt that such an empire had ever truly existed at all. But Babylon, the ancient city to the south, now rose again to power under a new dynasty, often called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Babylon entered one of its most splendid periods. The greatest king of this era was Nebuchadnezzar II. Under his rule, Babylon was rebuilt on a scale of magnificence that astonished all who saw it. The walls of the city were said to be enormous, with broad gates and tall towers. The temple of Marduk was restored and adorned. Processional avenues were paved with stone. Glazed bricks in deep blue and yellow lined the famous Ishtar gate, decorated with images of lions, bulls, and dragons. The city became a center of trade, learning, and religion, known throughout the ancient world. It was during this period that, according to tradition, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built. They became known to later writers as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were said to be lush, terraced gardens, planted with trees and flowers, rising in tiers above the palace, watered by some ingenious system that lifted water up from the river below. Whether they truly existed as described or in some other form remains a matter of scholarly discussion. No clear archaeological evidence has yet been found, yet the legend itself speaks to the reputation of the city. Babylon, even in its own time, was famous for its grandeur. The city was vast. Its outer walls were so thick that 2 chariots could ride side by side along the top. According to ancient writers who saw the ruins centuries later, the walls were pierced by many gates. Each gate was dedicated to one of the great gods of the city, and the most beautiful of these was the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of love and war. The Ishtar Gate was made of deep blue glazed bricks, polished and shining in the sun. Across its surface marched rows of carefully crafted animals, also rendered in glazed brick: bulls, lions, strange dragons known as Mushushu, sacred to Marduk. Each animal was outlined in gold and yellow against the brilliant blue background. When sunlight struck the gate at the right hour, the surface seemed almost to glow. A visitor approaching from the road would have seen the gate, rising tall above the plain long before reaching it. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, a long ceremonial avenue paved with carefully fitted stones. Along its walls, more rows of glazed brick lions stalked silently in profile. During the great festival of the New Year, statues of the gods were carried in solemn procession along this avenue. Priests led the way. Musicians played. Crowds gathered. Incense rose into the warm air. The king himself walked among the procession in his ceremonial robes. The entire city participated in the slow ritual of renewal. At the heart of Babylon stood the great temple complex of Marduk, and rising above it stood the temple's ziggurat, called Etemenanki. The name itself meant the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was enormous, several stories high, its top crowned with a small shrine where, according to tradition, the god dwelt. Some scholars believe that the story of the Tower of Babel, preserved in the Hebrew Bible, was inspired by this very ziggurat, a great tower in Babylon, rising toward the heavens, glimpsed by travelers and exiles, who carried its memory back to their distant homes. The city was filled with movement. The Euphrates River flowed directly through its center. Bridges connected the two halves of the city. Boats moved up and down the water, carrying goods from far away. Merchants from many nations could be seen in the markets. Egyptians, Phoenicians, Greeks, Arabs, Persians, people speaking languages no Babylonian had ever heard before, foods and spices and cloths from regions beyond the imagination of most ordinary people were laid out, for sale beneath cloth awnings in the bright sun. The exiles from Judah, brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar after the fall of Jerusalem, settled along the canals and rivers near the city. They built homes. They raised families. They continued their own religious traditions. They mourned the loss of their distant homeland. They wrote poems that survive to this day, capturing the strange double feeling of life in exile, the wonder of the great city around them, the longing for the hills of Judah they would never see again. Their experience would shape Jewish identity for centuries to come, and the memory of Babylon would echo, sometimes with awe and sometimes with sorrow, through many later traditions. For travelers approaching Babylon by river or by road, the first sight of the city must have been overwhelming. The high walls, the glittering ziggurat, the many gates, the smoke of countless fires rising from within, the sound, even from a distance, of voices and music and animals and movement. To walk for the first time through the Ishtar gate, beneath its glazed blue arches, between its silent lions, and into the long processional way, would have left an impression few would forget. Even today, parts of the Ishtar Gate have been reconstructed in modern museums. To stand before them is to feel a small echo of what that ancient traveler felt. The deep blue still shines. The animals still march in silent procession, the careful craftsmanship of artisans who lived more than two. And a half thousand years ago is still visible in every brick, a reminder that the splendor of Babylon was not only a matter of legend, it was a real city, built by real hands, glimpsed once by real eyes that have long since closed. Nebuchadnezzar's empire stretched across much of the ancient Near East. It included regions that had once been ruled by the Assyrians. It included the Kingdom of Judah, whose capital city, Jerusalem, he eventually captured. Many of the people of Judah were brought to Babylon as exiles. Their experience is recorded in the Hebrew Bible, including the famous verse beginning by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and wept. The history of Mesopotamia is woven in this way into the long memory of many other peoples as well. But Babylon, like all empires before it, eventually fell. In the 6th century before the Common Era, a new power arose in the East. The Persians, led by their king Cyrus the Great, swept across the region. They conquered Babylon, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. The Mesopotamian world became a province of a vast new empire centered far away in the highlands of Iran. The temples continued to function. The cities continued to be inhabited. Cuneiform writing continued to be used by scribes for several more centuries, but political independence was over. The age of native Mesopotamian kings had come to an end. After the Persians came Alexander the Great. After Alexander came his successors, who ruled the region as Greek-speaking kings. After them came the Parthians, then the Sasanian Persians, then the early Islamic caliphates. The cultures and religions of the region changed many times. Cuneiform writing fell gradually out of use. The temples of the old gods were abandoned. The names of the ancient kings were forgotten. The very locations of many cities were lost. Their ruins, slowly weathered by wind and sand, became low mounds in the desert, mistaken for natural hills. For nearly 2,000 years, the memory of ancient Mesopotamia almost disappeared from human awareness. The cities of Sumer and Akkad existed only as a few scattered references in the Bible and in classical Greek writers. The cuneiform script could no longer be read by anyone. The stories of Gilgamesh, of Inanna, of the great flood as Mesopotamians had told it, were sleeping in the dust, waiting The fading did not happen all at once. Cuneiform did not disappear in a single generation. It dwindled slowly, century by century, as new languages and new scripts took the place of the old. The Aramaic alphabet spread across the region. It was simpler than cuneiform, easier to learn, easier to write on lighter materials such as papyrus and parchment. For everyday business and correspondence, it gradually replaced the older system. Yet, within the temples, especially in Babylon, cuneiform persisted for a long time. The priests who studied the stars continued to record their observations. In the ancient script, they kept long diaries noting the positions of the planets, the appearances of eclipses, the heights of the river, the prices of barley in the market. These astronomical diaries were maintained for centuries, even as the city itself slowly declined under foreign rule. The very last known cuneiform tablet that scholars have identified was an astronomical text written in the 1st century of the Common Era. By that time, Babylon was already a fading provincial town. The temples were nearly empty. The priests were few. The script that had once filled the libraries of empires now survived only in the careful hands of a small number of elderly scholars. When the last of them died, the writing died with them. No one alive could read it any longer. For nearly 2,000 years after that, the wedge-shaped signs on the surviving stones and tablets were simply mysterious. Travelers who passed through Mesopotamia sometimes copied them, wondering what they might mean. No one could say. The thread of memory had been broken. The voice of Mesopotamia had fallen silent. When the rediscovery finally came, it came slowly. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European travelers began bringing back inscriptions copied from the ruins of ancient Persian palaces at Persepolis. These inscriptions included 3 different scripts side by side in 3 different languages. One of them was a form of cuneiform. Scholars suspected, correctly, that all 3 said the same thing. With patience and ingenuity, they began to break the code. A few signs were guessed, then a few names, then, gradually, entire words. The decipherment took decades. Different scholars in different countries contributed pieces of the puzzle. By the middle of the 19th century, The basic structure of cuneiform was understood. By the end of the century, scholars could read thousands of tablets fluently. The voices of the ancient kings, the prayers of the priests, the contracts of the merchants, the schoolwork of the students, the lullabies of the mothers, all began to speak again after 2,000 years of silence. The language returned, and then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the world began to remember. Travelers and scholars from Europe started to take an interest in the ruined mounds scattered across what is today Iraq, Syria, and southeastern Turkey. They began to dig. They found broken walls. They found carved stone reliefs. They found vast libraries of clay tablets. They could not yet read the strange wedge-shaped writing, but they recognized that they had stumbled upon the remains of a great forgotten civilization. The decipherment of cuneiform was one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era. Scholars worked patiently for years, comparing inscriptions in multiple languages. They identified names. They identified words. Eventually, sign by sign, they began to read. When they did, an entire vanished world rose again from silence. Kings whose names had not been spoken in 2,000 years suddenly had voices again. Letters between merchants, contracts between farmers, hymns sung in temples, prayers recited at bedtime, all became audible once more in the imagination. Every year, archaeologists continue to work in the lands of ancient Mesopotamia. Every year, new tablets are discovered, new sites are mapped, new understandings emerge. The work is slow. The history is enormous. There remains a great deal that we do not yet know. There are entire periods, entire cities, entire languages that are still poorly understood. The story of Mesopotamia is in many ways still being written, even thousands of years after it ended. And perhaps that is part of what makes this ancient world so endlessly fascinating. It feels distant, yet familiar, strange, yet recognizable. The people who lived along the Tigris and Euphrates so long ago were not so different from us. They worried about their children. They worked to feed their families. They wrote letters to absent loved ones. They argued with neighbors. They watched the moon rise. They feared death. They wondered about the meaning of their brief lives. They sometimes laughed. They sometimes cried. They built. They planted. They traded. They dreamed. They left behind clay tablets covered with their hopes and complaints. They left behind ruined cities and tall temple platforms. They left behind the foundations of writing, of law, of astronomy, of mathematics, of literature. They left behind a way of measuring time that still shapes every hour of our modern lives. And though their cities are gone, though their kings are dust, though their gods are no longer worshipped, something of their world remains. In the long shadow they cast across human history, in the slow, patient work of every scribe who copied a tablet by lamplight, in the rhythms of farming and trade and family life that began among them and continue in transformed shapes, even today and throughout history. Civilizations have continued to remember the lessons quietly carried forward from those ancient cities, the importance of water, the importance of cooperation, the importance of memory, the importance of recording what would otherwise be lost. For Mesopotamia was, in many ways, a civilization built upon memory. The scribe pressing reed into clay was protecting something against forgetfulness. The priest carving a king's name into stone was extending that name into the future. The astronomer noting the position of a planet was creating a record that other watchers, generations later, could compare with their own observations. The poet shaping the story of Gilgamesh was preserving the deepest feelings of a person who might otherwise have lived and died unheard. Even today, when modern people walk through museums and pause before fragments of carved alabaster, before tablets covered in tiny patient marks, before the smiling faces of ancient statues, something quiet passes between past and present. A recognition, a faint companionship across the centuries. And tonight, far beyond the cities of the modern world, far from the noise of highways and screens and constant motion, the ancient land between the rivers still exists somewhere in imagination. The wide, flat plains stretching toward the horizon, the slow, brown waters of the Tigris and Euphrates moving toward the Gulf, the crumbled mounds of forgotten cities rising softly above the desert, the wind passing across them as it has passed for thousands of years. Somewhere, a long stone wall still leans into the sand. Somewhere, a fragment of a ziggurat still rises against the sky. Somewhere, a buried tablet still waits to be unearthed, its ancient marks still sharp, still legible, still patient after all this time. In the lands of ancient Mesopotamia, life often began before sunrise. The pale eastern sky would slowly lighten. The first calls of birds would echo across the marshes. Fishermen would push their reed boats away from muddy banks. Farmers would lead donkeys out toward the fields. The priestesses of the temple would begin their morning rituals, lighting incense, offering bread and beer before the statues of the gods. Smoke would rise from 1,000 small cooking fires across the city, and then the sun itself would climb above the horizon, vast and red, washing the mud brick walls in soft, warm light. By midday, the heat became intense. The streets emptied. People retreated indoors into the cool darkness of thick walled rooms. Some lay quietly on woven mats, waiting out the worst of the afternoon. Others continued working, but slowly, drinking water and beer to stay refreshed. Even the animals sought shade beneath palm trees or against the shaded sides of walls. The world paused. Time itself seemed to slow during those long, hot afternoons. And then, as evening approached, the city revived. The light softened. The sky deepened into orange and gold. Cooler breezes drifted in from the river. People returned to the streets. Vendors reopened their stalls. Workers walked home. Families gathered for the evening meal. Children played in the dusty squares, while older people watched from doorways. Storytellers sat beside small fires, recounting tales heard from their own grandparents, who had heard them from theirs. And the long shadow of the ziggurat stretched across the city as the sun finally dropped toward the western horizon. Night brought a different beauty. The desert stars appeared in vast numbers above the flat plains. The temple priests climbed to high platforms to observe the heavens. The rivers caught the moonlight in long silver paths. The marshes far to the south rustled gently with reeds. The cattle settled in their pens. The doors of houses closed against the cool air. Oil lamps flickered in small inner rooms. Children fell asleep beside their parents. The city, for a few quiet hours, rested, and while it rested, the deeper rhythms of the world continued. The slow flow of the rivers, the slow shifting of the stars, the slow accumulation of layers of sediment along the river banks, the slow centuries of civilization quietly piling one generation upon another, memory pressing into clay, cities rising and falling, languages forming and fading, the careful, patient work of human beings shaping a world for those who would come after. In ancient Mesopotamia, the marshes of the south held a special kind of beauty. Vast wetlands stretched across great distances near where the Tigris and Euphrates joined together. Reeds grew tall and dense. Water birds gathered in great flocks. Fish moved through warm, shallow pools. People who lived in the marshes built homes from woven reeds. They constructed elegant arched structures that have remained recognizable in form for thousands of years. They traveled in long reed boats. They lived in close relationship with the water itself, harvesting fish, gathering plants, raising water buffalo, weaving baskets, navigating quiet channels that hardly anyone from outside the region could find. For thousands of years, the marsh dwellers of southern Mesopotamia maintained their distinctive way of life. Their villages were nearly invisible from the surrounding desert. The reeds rose around them like green walls. The water hid their paths. Even modern visitors who managed to reach those communities sometimes describe the experience as stepping back across thousands of years. Some of the reed structures still being built in the 20th century resembled, in striking detail, images carved on stone monuments from Sumer. Continuity of culture, quiet and unbroken, drifting forward through long stretches of time. And in the dry plains farther north, life took different shapes. Pastoralists herded sheep and goats across the open country. They moved with the seasons, looking for new grazing. Their tents could be packed in a single morning and pitched again before evening. They traded wool and milk and meat to the city dwellers in exchange for grain, metal tools, and finely woven cloth. They lived under open skies, listening to the long sigh of wind across grass and dust. They had their own oral traditions, their own songs, their own ways of remembering ancestors who had lived under those same skies long ago. In the mountains to the north and east, other peoples shaped their lives around forests, valleys, and high pastures. They mined copper and silver. They cut timber and floated it down rivers toward the treeless southern cities. They worshipped their own mountain gods. They sometimes traded peacefully with the people of the lowlands. They sometimes raided the borders of the empires below. The relationships between mountain and plain shaped Mesopotamian history in countless ways across the centuries. And to the west, the long routes leading toward the Mediterranean carried caravans, scribes, soldiers, and pilgrims. Cities such as Mari and Ebla rose along these routes, becoming centers of trade and learning in their own right. Letters were exchanged between distant rulers, goods passed from hand to hand across great distances. The ancient world was already, in many ways, deeply interconnected. The traveler walking dusty roads under the hot sun might have heard a half-dozen different languages along the way, might have eaten food from 3 different regions in a single day, might have prayed to gods whose temples stood hundreds of miles apart. Throughout it all, the steady, patient labor of ordinary lives continued. Bread was baked, water was carried, children were raised, fields were planted, tombs were filled, memorials were inscribed. The world kept being remade, one quiet day at a time, and the kings, even the greatest of them, eventually passed away. Their statues were sometimes broken by later rulers. Their inscriptions were sometimes effaced. Their names were sometimes forgotten. But the rivers continued to flow. The seasons continued to turn. The stars continued to wheel slowly above the southern plains. And somewhere, in some quiet room of some quiet city, another young scribe would sit down, pick up a fresh tablet of clay, and begin to learn the wedge-shaped signs that had been used by scribes for 1,000 years before his birth, and would be used by other scribes for 1,000 years after his death. That long continuity, that quiet persistence, is perhaps the deepest gift of Mesopotamia to human memory. The reminder that civilization is built slowly by countless ordinary hands across many lifetimes. The reminder that even the simplest acts of recording, of teaching, of building, of caring, can echo across thousands of years. The reminder that human life, although brief, can leave traces that endure far longer than any single person could ever imagine. And tonight, as the modern world rests beneath its blanket of darkness, the ancient land between the rivers still lies quietly, beneath the same desert sky. Somewhere the ruins of Ur are silent in the moonlight. Somewhere the broken walls of Babylon stand patient beside the meandering Euphrates. Somewhere the great mound that was once Nineveh rises softly above the plain, its old palaces buried in earth, its stone relief of kings and lions and winged spirits resting quietly beneath thousands of years of accumulated dust. The wind moves across the wide, flat country. The rivers continue their long, slow journey toward the Gulf. The night sky, undimmed in places far from cities, glitters with the same stars that the ancient priests once studied. The constellations move overhead in the same patterns they have always followed. The world is older than empires and quieter than memory, and gradually, as the hours of the night deepen, the imagined world of ancient Mesopotamia softens further into dream. The cities recede, the voices fade, only the rivers remain. The Tigris flowing eastward, the Euphrates flowing westward, their waters moving slowly under moonlight, soft sounds of small waves brushing against muddy banks, reeds bending gently in the cool air, a single boat drifting somewhere along a forgotten channel, a pale lamp glowing briefly inside a distant doorway, and then nothing, only the wide, quiet plain, the long, ancient sky, the slow, patient pulse of time itself, the rivers continuing onward, the stars continuing onward, the night continuing onward, the breath softening, the thought softening, the world growing still, the land between the rivers fading gently into sleep. Far across the plain, a single mound rises softly above the dust, the last trace of a city whose name has been forgotten for thousands of years. The moon passes slowly above it. The wind moves quietly across its surface. The buried tablets within sleep on, their wedge-shaped signs still sharp, still patient, still waiting. Somewhere a small wave laps quietly. Somewhere a reed whispers softly. Somewhere moonlight rests on still water. The river continues without hurry. The night continues without end. The ancient land between the rivers rests beneath the slow turning sky, and only the night remains. Only the river, only the soft moonlight resting on quiet water, only the slow drifting silence. Beneath the long, quiet, and ancient sky,